that, you know, the other photo we had at the beginning, you know, there's a new, it's been, there's a different kind of facade, but the basic structure of the front of this building, it's now, this was 2 buildings. This was simply an archway that connected 2 separate museums. On this side, the north side, this was the Museum of the Chinese Revolution when this building was originally, these were constructed. This side was called the Museum of Chinese History. So it was the Museum of the Chinese Revolution and the Museum of Chinese History, which means from antiquity onward. All right, so this part of the presentation is called Renewing Hegemony at the National Museum of China. Hegemony is one of those loaded analytical terms that's used sometimes. I'm using it in the sense that cultural studies uses it these days, or often has used it, in the sense that power, when people use the word hegemony in certain kinds of analytical contexts, what they mean is that power doesn't just come from the barrel of a gun, as Mao Zedong said, but it also comes from getting people to buy into what you want them to buy into in terms of political power and legitimacy of a ruling elite. All right, so, and then other cultural theorists have said a lot of this has been done in the 20th century, you know, building hegemony, getting the consent of the people to rule over them. A lot of this is done and maintained through various kinds of media in the cultural sphere. All right, so, you know, people have using the term hegemony and sort of hegemonic negotiation is another term that's sometimes been used and I've used also. It means that within the concept of hegemony, nothing is ever completely fixed and static. It's always moving a bit, and there's room for, at most times, in power structures, for the people themselves to have some say over how authority is exercised over them. Of course, the people in power want to have absolute power, but they know that, especially in the modern world where information flows fairly freely, that they have to get people to really want them to exercise that power, to be effective in the long run. Okay, so the title of this part is Renewing Hegemony at the National Museum of China. The major focal point when major renovations of this structure began in the 1990s was to beef it up, to make it bigger, to make it more grandiose, to redo the exhibits, to create much more space. In fact, the goal from the very beginning of, it's always been a monumental structure, a socialist monumental structure, but the goal was to make it the biggest contiguous museum space in the world, and they did. They actually called, the planners actually called the British Museum while they were doing this to make sure that they had the correct square footage so that they would be bigger than the British Museum. Okay, so that was one, it's definitely all about being big and the biggest in the world. And when this first started, it was also before the 2008 Olympics. It didn't get done until 2011. But at the time that it started, this renovation project, everybody thought this was probably also going to be, you know, part of what the Olympic planning was all about in Beijing, that it was intended for foreign guests as well as Chinese. All right, so I kind of told you what's in my notes here. The National Museum structure originally was built in 58, 59. There were actually 10 big building projects then, meant to represent the power of both the new Chinese nation and of the Chinese Communist Party. I told you about the 2 museums. It was also supposed to be, especially the part of the Museum of the Chinese Revolution, it was supposed to be, it was changing, the exhibit changed all the time because it had to correspond to the correct political line, as it's called in China, in Chinese politics. So it was supposed to represent Mao Zedong's red line, but that changed quite a bit in the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. So periodically, this museum has always closed down so that the exhibits could be redone. All right, so that to talk about closing it and redoing it was nothing new. All right, here's the next slide. All right, so what about the renovation project? This is how it looks now. You can see they put these big, you know, some kind of, it's a facing kind of material. They've changed the color from the original brick. But, you know, so now it looks like it's stone, but actually the brick is still there. It's covered up now. But this whole area that was once open. They've enclosed that and expanded it backwards. You can actually look at this on Google Maps. And if you go to Tiananmen Square and you look in the middle of Beijing and you look at this on Google Maps, this is an incredibly large building now that's all joined together. So it's actually got 3 wings. It's got the 2 original wings, and then it's got a huge new wing of galleries that goes back in this direction. So that would be eastward going back. It looks, from the front, it looks pretty much the way it's always looked. But when you go into it, it looks completely different from the way it used to look. And I'll show you that photo in a minute. All right, so this was a big deal when this renovation started. It started in the late 1990s. The plans for it. It really got underway in full swing in 2003 when the 2 museums were joined formally and renamed the National Museum of China. In 2004, the leadership of this new museum issued an invitation to 11 international architectural firms to submit bids for redesign of the museum, a competition that was won by a German firm working in association with the Chinese Academy of Building Research, a long-standing government-sponsored institute. But it took a long time, even when the agencies were decided upon, it took a long time to agree upon a final plan. It had to be just right, and lots of people were involved in the planning stage. And it took, let me see, it took until, I've got the date here, well, we know that it was supposed to open in 2008, and it didn't. It closed, all of it closed for a long time while the big building of the new sections were added on. Parts of it would periodically open up and then close again as more of the renovations were conducted. Finally, after many, many, many delays, I actually went in the fall of 2010 because it was supposed to open for October 1st National Day in 2010. It didn't open. So I did a few other things while I was painting. It finally opened in March of 2011, and indeed it was the largest contiguous museum space in the world, measuring in at 191,900 square meters. All right, so it's about, I think it's about 900 square meters bigger than the British Museum. All right, here is another image of the exterior. This is actually this is the doorway at the north side of the big structure. So when you go behind that first set of pillars, there's still a little bit of a sort of an arcade area in the interior. This is where you get your tickets, and then you stand in line. Security is like going through, I don't know, it's like the airport security and more. It's like going in, they've got metal detectors, and it's a little intimidating if you're intimidated by these sorts of things, because there's a special security squad and they're all dressed in black. Now, they're young folks, so they're not as intimidating as they might be, but the Chinese people are not intimidated, but they complain incessantly. What is all this for? While you're standing in line. All the Chinese are standing in line with your, why do we have to do this? What are we doing? Why do we have to stand in the line? So, but this is part of what's being created now in terms of entryway into some kind of new sacred space, almost, of the nation. All right, so you can see how big it is. You know, those are people standing there in line, and this is a very tall structure, as well as having a lot of square footage for display. All right, and now this is the area that used to be open. This is what you enter into once you get through those security doors. This is what it looks like inside. Now, this is all brand new, and it is, I have to say, it is very impressive when you walk in. It's huge, and it usually has lots of people in it. There are all kinds of, most of the people in it are Chinese. They're mainly Chinese tourists. People from all over China. This is one of the things you're supposed to do in your lifetime at least once, is go to Tiananmen Square and visit all of these structures that surround the square. So going up that's a stairway right there. Up there at the top, that's the north wing up there, and that's up on that wing. That's where the new exhibit in modern Chinese history resides. All right, so while there was a big struggle about how to achieve the sort of physical monumentality of the structure, there was an equally large struggle that went on for several years about exactly how to theme the new exhibit. From 2003 through 2009, the Modern History exhibit went through 2 major phases of revision under the guidance of the Propaganda Department of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party. And finally, they decided to rename it, and this is a significant name, I think, The Road of Rejuvenation. So the title revolution is not, or the word revolution is not even in the title of this exhibit now. Rather, it's a long road of rejuvenation. So to me, this is a kind of normalizing attempt to sort of think about the revolutionary process as being very beneficial to China, but no longer should it be thought of primarily in terms of revolutionary violence and class struggle. Right? Now it's all about rejuvenation, rebirth, a much softer, in Chinese it's certainly a much softer term, a term that was actually used by the Kuomintang more than the communists in the actual revolutionary period. Right? So now it's named this, finally. It went through, the exhibit went through several trial runs before it opened here. They actually first opened the exhibit while the building was under renovation at another museum down the road called the Chinese Military Museum. They staged trial runs of the exhibit there in 2007, fall of 2007 through the spring of 2008. And they collected lots of questionnaires from people who visited the exhibit to try to get opinions on it. All right, so it was open in that location for 6 months, and at that point, the party's propaganda chief called together representatives from a host of party agencies in Beijing to discuss further efforts at redesign of the exhibit. And over the next several months, this is now 2008, a series of forums were held that included a wide array of experts, many of whom were university professors of modern Chinese history, to develop a stronger presentation of the exhibit's new theme. Everything now had to circle around this theme of rejuvenation. In the midst of these forums, this is important, I think, debates erupted among the experts over exactly how to handle periods of revolutionary history characterized by contentious party infighting and its disastrous outcomes from the 1950s through the mid-1970s. All right, so if you look at your timeline for a minute on the handout, on the front page, you'll see that 1949, the People's Republic was founded on October 1st in 1949. You see 1952 as a landmark date when land reform was complete throughout the entire country. And then the periods I'm talking now about in terms of debate about how they should be represented in the exhibit are the next 2 things, 1958-61, the Great Leap Forward. And this is the period in which agricultural collectivization was undertaken. It was a very ambitious program, and it went wrong, and massive famine resulted throughout many places in the country, killing at least 20 million people. Now, everybody knows that, and the party actually admits that that happened. But laying blame for that is the controversial part of the story. And I'll show you how it's done in the exhibit, which is actually the official line. The exhibit has actually been critiqued by Western journalists and experts for not being more open and forthright about that event in particular. Also, the next event, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, China in that period came very close to civil war. And you'll see in a minute exactly how that's covered. It's covered in the exhibit, but also very, very briefly. You may be familiar with events in Tiananmen Square in 1989. That's absent from the exhibit altogether, even though the exhibit goes all the way up to the present. All right, so there is some discussion, but the experts debated this, and we do not have a full record of those discussions. But we do have in the records, actually some of these records of the discussions can be found on the National Museum's website. And I've read those documents. At the time, it was very clear that the Propaganda Bureau wanted everything, the head of the Propaganda Bureau in particular, wanted everything to revolve around the concept of rejuvenation. And his idea was that if there are things that are negative about our history, we can admit those mistakes, but we should not dwell on them because they do not reflect the theme of rejuvenation. All right, this made some of the university professors who were on these advisory boards unhappy, but this is the way I'll show you in a minute what the results of this were. All right, so not as much, there were some people who in fact wanted a much fuller accounting, apparently, of the tragedies that, in terms of deaths, that both the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution produced. But their point of view did not win the day at this moment. All right, so here is the exhibit. I'm only going to show you a little bit of the exhibit itself. This is the door. I've been back since this visit. This is a visit that I went on in 2011, right in June, went a couple of months after it opened. Now they've put up some big characters here that actually have the title, The Road of Rejuvenation in Chinese, Wuxing Zhilu, on the sides of this entryway into the exhibit. This is not, maybe you've never seen an exhibit quite like this before. This is like room after room after room after room of giant things. There are sculptures, there are huge photographs, and lots of them. One thing that struck me about it the first time I saw it was that none of this stuff has attribution. That is to say, the makers of these items are never identified. It's as though these things exist in some sort of pure ether, and this is the story, right? And it's like these things have been delivered unto us, and we are going to share them with you. All right, so this is the entry hall. I don't know, Jeremy, you may recognize this person walking in here. This is one of Jeremy's professors from UCSC.
Is that Joe?
Yeah, it's Joe Eschring. It's Joe on this particular visit. Okay, so yeah, that's a foreigner walking in. But a foreigner, so at that time was living in Beijing. And yeah, we actually had a bunch of UC students with us on this particular trip. All right, so this was my first visit, and the photos you're about to see are from my first visit. I had read Western news reports before I visited the exhibit, and it was critiqued very heavily in the Western press for, quote unquote, towing the party line, as Ian Johnson of the New York Times put it in the title of his piece describing his visit, which had happened a couple of months earlier. But I really wanted to see myself what I thought. I'm a China expert, right? I wanted to see what I think. Like I've said, it has a massive amount of material. It takes a very long time to go through this exhibit. I think on this first visit, I spent about 2.5 hours in it. And I had to go, I've been back many times, and I still don't feel like I've really done it justice. All right, so it's huge. But as I've said, I think this theme of rejuvenation really does try to normalize a lot of the revolutionary past and create a storyline in which the present and the past are linked, and the future as well is in one continuous line of development. Revolution is, after all, a disruptive process, one in which you shake things up. That's not the storyline that's being developed in this particular exhibit. All the events, all the wars are treated, but it's all somehow moving ultimately towards rejuvenation, which is a good thing, right? Everything that's happened, even though there's been violence along the way, all results in something very calm and good at the end. Let's see if there are any other points here. Okay. Yes, in this first room that you enter into, this is actually a mural in the entire room that is a kind of encapsulation of everything that's happened in China from the beginning of time up to sending things into space. So some folks worked very hard on this thing for a very long time, and it's just kind of, you walk in and it immediately puts you in some other world that you're going to experience in a different kind of way for a while. All right, so throughout the exhibit there are these huge boards. These things are as tall as this room. That are, and they're both in English, and you'll see the English isn't always the best, and Chinese. So these kind of guide you through the parts of the exhibit. To me, I was really kind of surprised at first when I started reading these, because they kind of read like Chinese textbooks. In terms of the language in which the story is developed, not much has changed, except for the title, The Road of Rejuvenation. Other kinds of things is all very bombastic, kind of turgid prose that that history uses in the Chinese context. You'll see things like this. The exhibition, therefore, clearly demonstrates the historical course of the Chinese people of choosing Marxism, the CPC, that's the Chinese Communist Party, the socialist road and the reform and opening up policy, and China's firm determination in building socialism with Chinese characteristics through adherence to this great manner, this special road and this theoretical system. All right, that's a very typical kind of prose that's used in the delivery of authoritative information to the Chinese public, both in textbook form and in these kinds of settings. All right, so the last paragraph here says, today the Chinese nation is standing firm in the East, facing a brilliant future of great rejuvenation. The long-cherished dream and aspiration of the Chinese people will surely come to reality. All right, so there's an inevitability about this. You're supposed to believe and feel that this is right, this is good, was all meant to be. All right, as you move through the exhibit, it's quite it's what I found the first time I went was I was just overwhelmed by the size and scale of everything, particularly these kinds of architectural facades. This is actually a facade of the founding of the building in which the Chinese Communist Party was founded in Shanghai in 1921. These kinds of architectural facades are in almost every one of the multiple halls that comprise this exhibit. You can also see the size, the blow up of a lot of the photographs that have been put on display. There are also display cases like this. There's so much stuff in this exhibit to come to terms with in every single exhibit hall. And the wall plaques are everywhere, creating a narrative of rejuvenation in 5 parts, each containing several sections. And here's my take on it. As it turns out, the first 3 parts turn out to be quite predictable in the sense that they follow well-established patterns of interpretation and presentation of the earliest portions of modern Chinese history. No surprises for people who have studied the way the Chinese have told this story for a while, up to 1949. So what I have to say in my notes here is that not much has changed in this part of the story, and one flows through it with relatively little that is new to digest, save for the fact that the sheer quantity of material is now so vast. All right, I need to speed up a little bit because I'm already talking way too long. I've got some interesting video clips I want to show you from the gallery, and I want to make sure that some of you get to hang around and see them. All right, so this is actually a very iconic painting. This is a very famous painting. This is not the original. This is actually one of the many replicas of this painting that's on display today, right smack in the middle of the exhibit as you finish the first part and get ready. This is at the 1949, the founding. The painting is called The Founding Ceremony of the Nation. That's Mao Zedong proclaiming from the Tiananmen Square podium that the People's Republic of China on October 1st, 1949 is now in existence. At this point, from this point onward, for my money, and I haven't talked to a lot of other people and their reactions to this, but to me, a very predictable narrative, once you pass this wall of the 1949 divide, completely falls apart. In the next section, which covers the 1950s and 1960s simultaneously, it's a big mishmash of lots of stuff side by side, some of which is very good, and some of which is problematic, some of the problems that the party had. So you'll see stuff like this, for example, side by side. You'll see the first caption here says, the people of North Korea bid farewell to Chinese troops returning home in 1958. This is a huge victory party, right? Happiness. At the same time, just very close by, you have this mass campaign against people in the party who were charged with corruption in 1951-52. One of the early party purges that happened, very, very early on after the founding of the People's Republic. All right, so these things there's no chronological order. There's no storyline that I could find or follow very easily in this part of the exhibit. There are these storyboards. They're there. They're giving you an outline. But here's one that I found. It took me a while. It takes a while for you to find this one. Actually, it's behind a big pillar. Because this is the one in which a statement is made about problems. All right, so it's called Setbacks in Progress. The title, Setbacks in Progress in the Exploration of Socialist Construction. So I just read this for a moment. It says, after the establishment of the socialist system, New China entered a period of socialist construction in all respects. The Chinese Communist Party led the people of all China's ethnic groups to painstakingly explore the laws of socialist development and clearly set forth the great goal of achieving the four modernizations. They developed their self-reliance and overcame hardships in the course of creating an independent and relatively comprehensive industrial system and economic system, which laid a crucial foundation of material and technology for socialist modernization. All right, so although it says setbacks in progress, you don't really know what the setbacks are. It's not clearly spelled out. Another way for me, when I read the Chinese title, I thought another way that you could have translated it was the following thing over here in my caption about it: tortuous developments while exploring socialist construction. All right, so there's an admission here that something went wrong, but it's not very clear what. Right? So you're not supposed to dwell on this. Oops, yes, that's my next one. All right, so I was like scurrying around at this point saying, what are the setbacks? Where are they? Where are they? So I had to like run around the whole big room and look for the setbacks. Finally, I found that this is actually three photos of the Cultural Revolution period. And there's one of the Great Leap Forward, this one, which is actually a very well-known photo. These are infamous small-scale steel furnaces that were a huge failure, an attempt to bring industrialization to the countryside that didn't exactly go so well. All right, so there's like a total of 4 photos total, and some short captions for each of them about these two major periods, the Great Leap Forward and the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which everyone admits, including the party itself, in a rather major policy proclamation document about its history in 1989, said things went wrong, things were bad. All right, but there's only 4 photos about these things going wrong. And this is what Ian Johnson in the New York Times, another Western journalist, complained so excessively about. All right, so here's the caption. This says, here you learn a little bit about what went wrong, but still not very clearly. In the face of the accomplishments of the first 5-year plan, Mao Zedong, the party's central committee, and leading cadres from many local areas developed an air of overconfidence and self-content. And ignoring economic laws with an eagerness to succeed, they launched the Great Leap Forward and the People's Commune movement, attempting through the method of a mass movement to speed up the pace of socialist construction. This is one sentence, right? Resulting in the serious proliferation of left-minded states, thus causing socialist construction to suffer serious setbacks. The photo is of small and tall furnaces used in local attempts at making steel. Okay, so Mao's a bit at fault, but it's also those leading cadres from many local areas, and they're overly confident and self-content. There's no mention made of famine. There's no mention made of the failure to put grain into areas that needed it, and the fact that people were overestimating what was being done in terms of harvests. Rather, it's pretty vague. This is more or less the line taken in the resolution on party history, or the history of our country. Is it party history? It's the resolution of party history, I think, 1989. This is more or less the line taken there. Mao Zedong is now thought to have been, it's 70% good and 30% bad. And that's more or less being captured in this kind of rather vague caption. All right, here's the Cultural Revolution photo that says the most. It actually labels this event the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. The other 2 photos don't even use that title for this event. And here's what it says. The Great Cultural Revolution from May 1966 through October 1976 was an internal upheaval mistakenly launched by leaders. Oops, it's supposed to say and. Manipulated by a counter-revolutionary clique. That's the gang of people known as the Gang of Four, subsequently who were tried and put in prison. Bringing serious disasters upon the party, the nation, and the entire nation's peoples. The photo is during the Great Cultural Revolution, showing a reception by leaders of Red Guards and mass groups in Tiananmen Square. All right, so here's the photo again. This is actually also a very well-known photo. So again, nothing new, no admission of exactly who's to blame or what happened, but there is a little crack, right? There's a little capacity for at least having these photos here at all. And I have seen on subsequent visits, I have seen people stand in front of these photos for a long time. People tend to go through this exhibit at their own pace, young and old alike, lots of school groups go. Older people will stand and stare at these photos and not say anything, and look at them for a while and then move on. All right, so my imagination, right, my wild imagination is that they're thinking about their own private memories in these moments when they're kind of confronted with the power of the state. They know their government is telling them these things happen, but they also know that they're really not supposed to broadcast their memories far and wide, although some people sometimes do. It's not really the most acceptable way to deal with these very unpleasant moments in the revolutionary history of modern China. All right, so moving along then, the rest of the exhibit after this chaotic room of what I call the room of chaos of the 1950s and 1960s, when you move into the Reform era, everything, all the stuff in those rooms from the Reform era onward, and each of the major leaders has a room and is treated, the period of his being in power, post-Mao. It's all in color. All the photographs are suddenly in color. Everything looks really great, and things are getting better all the time. Lots of very nostalgic kind of photos of Deng Xiaoping, the person who came to power immediately after Mao. But this is the last room of the entire exhibit, another huge whole room of a mural. And people often stand there and take photos like this one. So this is, I think this is probably a young communist, it's a communist, it's the Communist Party members probably of a work unit who have come together to see the exhibit. Maybe they've come from outside of Beijing and they've come together, on a tour. And they've got a flag with them. And they brought the flag to take the picture, right? So this exhibit for many ordinary Chinese does evoke great feelings of patriotism. There are extensive comment books, which I have paged through. There's also an electronic comments board that you can write comments on. Most of the comments, all of the comments, are praiseworthy in some way, shape, or form. Many times people will simply write, "Long live the motherland," or they will write things about how happy they are to see that so much was invested in this exhibit, that now that the glorious history of the motherland is revealed to all in a very appropriate way. All right, so in many, the people who express their emotions and take their pictures in this way are pretty happy with all of this. I would say from the point of view of the Chinese citizenry, this is a pretty successful exhibit. Westerners, the Western critics, hate it. The Chinese tend to love it. So that's in and of itself, I think, something worth thinking about. What purposes has the millions that have been spent on this, what purposes have been served? I do think that giving the Chinese people something to reflect on in terms of the glory of their nation has been achieved. And we might have judgments about that. But it seems to have made lots of Chinese quite happy, including these folks who really have no memories of their own of that era. All of these people were born after 1978. But now they have been educated in a very pleasant way for a few hours about this revolutionary history in a visual way that makes them want to take their picture and commemorate the event. So a new memory is being created here, and a new community a community of viewers of this exhibit are coming together and expressing their own now something emotional about these events that they feel happy about for the most part. These kinds of folks, the younger folks, I've never seen them looking at those photos of the Great Leap Forward in the Cultural Revolution. They simply aren't concerned with those events. They didn't experience them. It's gone, it's past, and most of them, ordinary folk like this don't want to have much to think about that. It's not something they need to do. All right, that's the National Museum. I told Jeremy I want it to be finished at this point, but I've still got the Qizhou Bao. So let me try to move through this a little bit more quickly. I actually have some video clips that will break up the monotony of my voice for you. But I need to tell you a little bit about the workers' paradise that this was first before we look at this place is across town. It's actually, you know, in bad traffic, it could take an hour in a taxi to get from Tiananmen Square to this place. In good traffic, it should take something like 20 minutes. But there's no good traffic anymore in Beijing. All right, so this is Bauhaus style architecture, very famous in Germany in the 1950s. These kinds of structures, these are factory workshops originally. These are window panes that let in the light, and they're like windows that can be pushed open, some of them to let air in. This was thought to be the healthiest kind of industrial environment to create for workers. So this place was originally built in the 1950s. This is in an area of Beijing, outside of Beijing at that time, called Dashanzi. So you will also see it referred to in that way occasionally. This is the workers' paradise. All right, but this is the workers' paradise at the state at which it had been abandoned. And the state in the reform era, the Chinese state in the reform era, gave up ownership and direction of these kinds of places. Private groups were created of various kinds to run them, and most of the factories were closed. Some remained open, but a lot of them had closed by the 1990s and were vacant. There are also workers' living quarters throughout this area. All right, but this is the kind of stuff that was left. It had not been demolished when artists decided to start moving in here in the very late 1990s and in a big way from 2002 onward. All right, so my notes here say, it probably goes without saying that what happens across town in private artist galleries at Qizhouba in relationship to memories of revolution is very different. Whoops, sorry. I keep doing the wrong thing in terms of scrolling. I'm not used to scrolling. Okay. At least in terms of who directs the efforts, but regenerating collective memories of revolution for new purposes at the National Museum and at Qizhouba are not unrelated phenomena. In fact, one of my most important contentions as I have developed this project is that the constant interplay of official and private reshapings of collective memory of revolution in China's post-socialist era drives creativity on both sides and pushes the Chinese government ultimately to want to fund both types of efforts as massive projects in consuming revolution not only for the good of the nation, but also for their own longevity as leaders. Artists and curators who promote very different practices of remembering revolution at Qizhouba, therefore, are thus rarely, if ever anymore, outright prosecuted or even seriously harassed by the government. Rather, the government now invests millions in helping to promote their venues as being good for the Chinese economy. All right, so I have a little section on the history of this place, but I'm going to forgo that because I think you'll be more interested. And if any of you want to see more about the history of the place, I brought some of the books I've collected along the way. There are a lot of historical photos of the East German days of Qizhouba in this particular book. It's called Beijing Qizhouba. All right, so I'm going to forgo that part. I'm not going to forgo my slides, but I'm going to forgo my talk, some of it. This is what it looks like today, and actually this was 2011, and I haven't been back since 2012. I was there 2010, 2011, 2012, and then the air pollution was so bad in the summer of 2012, I just haven't been able to bear to go. But I need to go. I'm going to go winter this year. I'm going to go sometime between January and March. It'll be cold, but the air will be maybe sometimes will be a little bit better than the summer. All right, so a lot has been invested in this place. Foreign investors have collaborated with Chinese artists to sell artwork out of galleries. There is joint investment here. And the city government in Beijing has invested in this place, and the national government has also invested. So this is an article from August 12, 2011, about 1.4 billion new investments to build this art zone in Beijing. All right, it already looked like this in 2011. Already a lot had been invested, but another 1.4 billion by 2015, which is coming right upon us, was to be invested in this place. So these interiors, this is the Bauhaus-style architecture from inside. Today, as the buildings have been renovated and turned into art galleries. They make great galleries, lots of natural light. They once made great workshops for industrial workers. All so now I get to show you something other than me talking. I have a couple of video clips, and I have two DVDs. One is from about Chidoba, and I'm going to show you short chapters from it. You're going to meet some of the original artists who went to Chidoba in around 2000 or so, 2002. Huang Rui, this person, he went in 2002 and kind of became the head honcho for a period of time. But you're going to see that by the time he's giving this interview, I think this video was made in 2008, he says he's on his way, he's ready to leave. And Lucia is the founder of the gallery that I've made the second part of this talk, the founder of Longmarch Space, and you'll see him talking a bit in this video as well. So let me turn to this for a minute. I have to turn off my mic. No. Oh. Here we go. Who knows now? What time do you?
不是一个直接性的这种表达，因为我们在说对这种共产主义这种去表达这些主题的时候，实际上是更说的是我们在通过作品来表达我们在中国作为一个中国人的生存的一种感受，而我们的生存感受和这些体制和刚才说的这种政治和我们生活中方方面面是有关的。对我们来说呢，就是因为我们就是一直在中国生存，在中国出生，然后经历了中国这些历史和现实，所以我们觉得对我们影响最大就是一个政治。
我相信需要轻松的节拍来配合。马上我们要听到的是一组非常欢快的单曲。首先，苏宁为您送上的是王心凌的这首《Hi Hi Bye Bye》。
我们不想仅仅停留在这个像一般的普通的感觉，仅仅是对毛的一个表面的一个处理。我们希望通过这些不同的作品，立体的来探讨这种共产主义体制对我们生活的影响和历史的影响。
So Mao is famous for the saying, "Power grows out of the barrel of a gun." So this is the takeoff on that idea.
像这些也是我们正在做的一些作品没有做完。这些雕塑已经做了有半年多了，因为这儿只是一部分。昨天我们去我们新的工作室，他们都看到了，已经有多了。当然有一些做的可能不是特别符合我们的想法，有些正在重新做。不是，就是普通的这种工人、民工、农民，是我们请他们来做模特。我们因为这个要做将近200个，要做的真实比较大。就是 是现在对我们来说，做一个作品有时候会用很长的时间，一个艺术计划。像这个作品，列宁这个已经做了快4个月了。商讨就是对这个作品将来是怎么来实施，也许会把它放倒，然后把它就是结构对它一个拆解，重新去组合它。因等着它完全做完之后，我们还要转换材料，把它做成铸铜的，不锈钢的，5米多高，就是比这个房子还高1米多。因为列宁呢与中国这个社会背景都是有很密切关系的。像我们在小的时候都会看列宁在1918，列宁在10月电影。列宁也是我们认为这种共产主义这种暴力革命的第一个创举。然后到了斯大林，杀人更多；然后到了毛泽东，杀人更多。实际上这个图示呢，就是这种2个手这样对着，实际上是我们是模仿拷贝的一个米开朗基罗有一个天顶壁画，就是一个上帝和亚当。就是手指一触的那一瞬间。我觉得是不好的，因为这儿本来是一个很专业的一个艺术区，艺术家选的这个地方，因为安静，价格便宜，房租，然后后来吸引了不少专业人士过来，是一个很好的交流的地方。现在后来政府开始接管这个地方，然后马路修得很齐，很整齐，然后警察排的很多，然后很多旅游客来了，房租越来越贵，问题非常多。
我觉得主要的呢是一开始呢就是这儿相对比较自由，就是没有太多的人来干涉你来做什么展出什么。现在呢就是说政府管的比较多一些。
但是现在呢是政府成了政府的一个招牌的这个地方，不是政府方面、物业方面，他们不想让我们在这儿。
对，因为我们做的这些作品，他们不喜欢我们待在这儿了。
他就想让我们走，但是只是我们没走。
现在更多的还是政治东西，政治和宗教都。
但是呢，他只是认为哪些艺术家，哪些作品不行，他不希望你在这儿。比方像我们在这儿，他们就觉得不舒服。对，因为去年派了2个保安在门口看着，像什么6四、博尔格都不可以的。
对，就是像文化大革命的话题，1989年的事情也是不对。
他这件作品，这不是我们的作品。这是另外一个艺术家的作品，只是在我们这儿展出了，叫武文健。他画的是和6四相关的天安门，所以在这儿展出的时候，在这儿展出的时候， 把展览给封掉了。
Okay, so this man is one of the person who really began to make this into a place where lots of people would come.
有很多经历呢是展览会被取消了，我有一段时间，也不准回到中国，大概有6年的时间。我2001年回到北京，然后我就开始找我自己的工作室。我在2002年1月份的时候找到了798，我觉得这个工厂太好了。对，我在798租下了地方，可是他们只租给我3年的时间，因为他们在2005年年底之前，他们都要把这边拆掉，你知道吗？我开始提出一个概念，说这个工厂可能是包豪斯风格，我们应该保护这个工厂建筑。在中国做这样的事情，等于破坏了城市的发展计划。破坏了政府的决定，这样的事情是非常不容易的，在北京特别没有成功的例子。后来呢，我们就开始就是讲这个工业建筑的历史，然后也开始做一些艺术活动，再加上和七星集团的矛盾，因为这个矛盾出现了以后，我们就找朋友，因为我们没有权利，七星集团有这个土地的权利，我们在法律上没有任何的这个权利，那么我们就是让它变成不是和法律上的矛盾，而是和城市的问题，对于传统和新的文化的问题，变成其他的问题，对于这个艺术的保护的问题。其实我觉得第一个，我想我的工作已经做完了，其实我也不管它5年以后变成什么样子。
Il 95% è solo commerciale. Siamo venuti qui in Cina nel 1988, quest'anno festeggiamo.
He's short, but you'll see a marked contrast between him and the people you've just heard talking. He has a master's degree in curatorship from Goldsmiths at the University of London and lived in the United States before going back to China. Here he is.
The word government is very problematic here because the long march journey is long. So at times you are engaging with the urban space, at times you're working with the official museums. And even an official museum that's divided between the traditional and the contemporary. At times you go to very distant, remote areas, but where still government, means the head of the village, still representing the party and the government. When you say the interest is great, actually there's a problem here. Long March always try to address that. How many percent of this interest is suppressed or manipulated or based on the cliches and then misunderstandings and misreadings and even create more dislocation and rupture? It's very difficult to judge. So, and for example, the last few years, international interest mostly about Chinese market, Chinese art market, and the interest in artists has been narrowly moving to very limited space. Collecting of Chinese conceptual art, video, new media, rather challenging, provocative, social engaging work is, I wouldn't say zero, but it's very limited. And foreign investment type or political exotic approach of Chinese big face, silly, smiling, laughing face with Mao Zedong social memory iconography, that kind of very problematic interpretation of our history in a cynical way, actually receive huge international market support.
Alright, so I'm going to come back to Lucia in a minute, but in the meantime, let's go back to our presentation. Alright, so alright, let me move on to the next slide here, sorry. What Lucia went back to China, he conceived, he was living in New York, and he created a foundation which he called the Long March Foundation. And he was beginning to gather up money. He used a lot of his own money. He's an artist, and he made some money selling some things and working for somebody famous in the import-export business, I forget who exactly, between China and the United States, and had some money. He sold everything and decided to move back to China, but he created this Long March Foundation. Oh, the mic, I'm sorry. I forgot the mic. So, he then, after he created the foundation, his plan was, and we might ask, why did he call it Long March? I've yet to meet Lucia because he's hardly ever there in Beijing. He's only there for openings and things. But I've interviewed his gallery director many times, and he's a Chinese American guy who's pretty honest about everything. The first time he and I met, I was in the gallery for the first time looking at things, and he came up, he approached me, and he looked very Chinese, and he spoke perfect English, and he nearly knocked me down because it was I was not expecting this person to walk up to me and speak in perfect English, and I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Texas." So, but he's told me that in some ways the title, this name for this project, this art project that Lucia has conceived, that seems to be historical in some way and tapping into memories of revolution, and indeed it does, and he writes about that a lot, and his fellow curators and artists write about it and talk about it a lot. But it's also, David, the manager, has said, it's also instrumental in the sense that we're politically correct. We have adopted a name which no one's going to critique. The Long March is one of the great victories of early Chinese Communist Party history. It's the survival march. They're being attacked, the young Red Army is being attacked by the Nationalist Party, and they march for a year for 6,000 miles. And they end up, a lot of them die, but the leaders all survive. And from that point onward, they begin to develop a huge movement in another location in China, and eventually from that point succeed. So the Long March is one of these, it's almost like a birthing story, of a movement that is fated to be successful. And he names it the Long March Project. And his first idea is that he's going to take a bunch of artists, all the famous artists he can convince in China, to go with him and redo the route of the Long March. Because he said, as he wrote about it and talked about it at the time, he said, this generation of artists, in order to be correctly functioning artists in Chinese society today, we have to come to terms with memories of the revolutionary past. He puts it in that way. So his idea is that we're going to go back and retrace the route of the Long March. He says the historical Long March has spanned multiple temporalities, narratives, disciplines, and processes, and thus it provided a metaphor that enabled me to see the current expression of contemporary Chinese art in a globalized context. Within the Chinese collective memory, the cultural meaning of the Long March is something that is still in progress, pursued but not determined. Issues of utopia, foundation, borders, crossing, local context, identity, migration, body, and methodology are taught. He's been trained at Goldsmiths in London, right? And methodology are topics engaged with and by the historical Long March and continue to form a vital part of our imagination today. So I think what Lu Jie had in mind from the outset was the idea that if you could get as many of the most productive and up-and-coming artists together to go on this trip together and redo the Long March, that their creative juices would somehow be released through that process. They would be touching some deep spot in their collective historical memory of what it means to be a Chinese artist at this time and place. They would go back. He also talks in other things. He has written about this, about the importance of taking art to the masses and learning about the masses. You know, this was one of Mao's things, you know, to interact with the masses and learn the true way to be a proper human being. He talks about that. He believes that too, you know, and after the first, the Long March, they designed a project that was supposed to have 20 stopping points along the Long March Trail. I'm talking to David, the manager, about all of this. David said, well, we only did 12, you know. I said, why did you only do 12? And it's written about, but I said, why? It's never said why they only did 12 instead of 20. He said, because everybody just started being an artist, and they started leaving and coming back, and we couldn't keep them all together, and Lu Jie got so frustrated, he just decided to go home, you know, and take what had been done and do something with that in terms of exhibiting some of the work that had been done. All right, so I'm going to do this very briefly, but I just want to show you some very short clips. There's a DVD that they produced called Long March, a Walking Visual Display. They did this, when did they do this exactly? Forgetting exactly. 2002, I think they did this, yep. All right, so this is one of the things that someone, an artist, did along the way. He actually had the route of the Long March, every place where they were going. He had it tattooed on his back. This is a real tattoo. The things they did, you'll see, that are sometimes very outrageous on this Long March, a walking visual display. And you'll see the reactions of the local people, which they were really there in part to get the reactions of the local people. All right, so I have to figure out now how to get from one device to another easily. That's not coming. The DVD player. Hold on. Okay, I have to eject this one. I'm sorry to have to waste time doing these things. It takes a minute for my DVD player to eject, so hold on a sec. It's ejecting. Anybody want to go to sleep? I'm sorry, I'll finish soon. I'll try to get through this last part quickly. Go to display. All right, so what you're going to see now is the start of the Long March. This is just some video clips that they put together based on what they did when they were on this great artist journey together on the trail. Chicago was one of them. A lot of this is considered to be educational in one way, shape, or form. both for themselves and for others, including people they meet along the way, and education moving in both directions. So see, there's some stainless steel stuff that they've mounted in the courtyard of the old Revolutionary headquarters. See, now I was pretty baffled by this stuff at first because I'm by no means an expert in contemporary art. But I think what's going on for a lot of this is feeling. It's about feeling. So what artists are feeling and what they want to bring with them for the purposes of installation is what they bring.
以这个线与线理
Or what they create while they're there.
3个线理 OK 完了
Okay, I'm going to move this forward a little bit. It is a scene that is so outrageous. I think it makes you laugh, but it also maybe makes you cry. But some of it's really funny. So,
这个地方，好，都这样做，然后我们就顺着这些架子就贴过去，好不好？
Okay, so this is about Marx and Jesus. They're both wearing outfits. All right, I'm going to stop this here. I originally wanted to play more, but there's a real. Well, I think it's too late. I have to stop this now. Okay. All right, but this is actually a cool DVD that has a lot of interesting things about the. I mean, there are even more outrageous things than what I've already shown you happening on the long run. All right. What I'm going to do now is, in order to move this forward to conclusion, is I'm just going to tell you briefly about what became sort of a follow-up to when the Long March walking visual display was over. Luja created some exhibits, and at that point he did not yet have a gallery space in Chijoba, but he went to Chijoba because other artists were gathering there, and a lot of the people he had with him on this walking display trip on the Long March Trail already had galleries and workspaces there. So he went there too and decided to make a gallery of his own there as the first place where he would display some of the works that had been produced for the walking visual display. He also did some exhibits elsewhere in the world. He took it to New York for a period of time and tried to do more walking journeys with people in various locations. But he settled, actually, at Chijoba and started mounting more exhibitions there. And as he did this, as this point says, the commercial dimensions of Luja's work began to soar. He began to become, he became an extremely successful curator and began to sell works out of his gallery at very large prices. This is the time, just the time when the Chinese art market began to take off. Some of these works now get, they bring hundreds of thousands of dollars now for sale, and sometimes some of them are so famous now they're auctioned for even more. This success actually produced a long series of critiques by others of Luja, and because he started out saying he was all about the simple life of politics, right? The getting back in touch with the people. He did a big project, he actually went to the countryside, organized people. David, his manager, was one of the managing people of this project. They went to a place where Chinese peasants produced paper cuts. They went there, they got everybody to make paper cuts, they collected a big archive of paper cuts, they took that back, they displayed those. But at the same time, he's beginning to make hundreds of thousands of dollars with his curatorship. All right, so he did then, in the summer of 2009, have a big forum at his home in Beijing, in which he allowed people to raise their critiques of him, and he admitted some mistakes of the Long March project, many things. People accused him of kind of being too much of an opportunist, using the name Long March and not really doing anymore the original thing that one intended with this naming and activity. And he said he was also, he admitted to being kind of a control freak and wanted to be in charge of everything, and he didn't allow other people to take enough initiative, things like this. Nonetheless, he creates phase 2. He says it's not really phase 2, but he decided he's going to gather artists from throughout Southeast Asia. And he met a curator in Vietnam who he actually brought to Beijing for a period of time. She's an Australian. And they started writing a lot of things together, and they gathered a much smaller grouping of artists, now only 15 of them, and they're not all artists. Some of them are quote-unquote intellectuals. They decided they were going to march another historical trail, the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam. So they had a lot of preparatory work, and some of them went and walked the Ho Chi Minh Trail together. Some of them were Chinese. 3 of them were Vietnamese, and some were either Chinese or Vietnamese living in diaspora in Hong Kong, Taiwan, or the United States. A very prominent visual artist from Taiwan actually became part of this new group. And when Lou returned to Beijing, that's Lou actually up there in the glasses, not the guy with the mic, but the other person. He's looking a little distracted now, don't you think? When Lou returned to Beijing, he staged the following exhibition, which he called a rehearsal. There was a big art exhibit coming up in Shanghai that he was going to take pieces to try to sell. And here's what the exhibit looked like. This is called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is when I first stumbled across the Luja's enterprises in the fall of 2010. This exhibit was going on in the Long March Gallery. And it looked like this. What did this have to do, I said to myself, with the Ho Chi Minh Trail? It also looked like this, things like this, side by side. Here are a lot of photographs from the journey that he took other artists and intellectuals with him to in Vietnam. But there's also other stuff kind of performance art piece here, side by side. This is the famous Taiwan artist who set up his video installations in the Long March Gallery, and had these kinds of public forums where he talked about his work. This is all part of an exhibit after walking on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And then things like this, written on the walls, mounted on the walls, all kinds of interesting questions, but what do they mean, I said to myself. Something like, when you are told about a way called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, this is what we call a political moment, and in this moment you are not innocent. Anybody who has not been told about the trail is also not innocent. The Ho Chi Minh Trail exists in every one of us. You know, so it's like, it sounds like it's important, but exactly how, you know? I mean, it's kind of hard to decipher some of the things they were beginning to produce. Nonetheless, the sentiment is still here to get in touch with important moments of revolutionary past, now in an international way, with evoking not just the Long March, but also the Ho Chi Minh Trail. All right, I'm going to wrap this up briefly, very briefly. I have 2 concluding slides. This is all I should. Why is it not moving? It's tired. It won't move anymore. I'm really baffled why it won't move. Here, let's try it. There we go. All right. All right. By way of conclusion, as you can see, I'm kind of ending what feels like kind of midstream, but that's where it's at. That's where all of this is at in Beijing today. It's all kind of in midstream. So I want to come back now to the big questions raised alongside my theme statement at the beginning of this presentation. Why is there an escalation of interest in the revolutionary past in China today? What drives this impulse and what fuels it to the extreme point of governmental investment that exists in Beijing today? This won't work either. My last slide. All right. The juxtaposition of negotiation, that hegemonic negotiation at the National Museum, was soul-searching by curators and artists at Qizhouba about their roles in resurrecting memories of people's revolution, demonstrates some tentative answers, at least one more, and at least one more follow-up question along the following lines. I have more questions than answers still in this project. In the post-socialist era that began in 1978, ideological certitude that fixed Chinese identity as a revolutionary society has waned. Mistakes were made, and even the party now publicly admits, but the accomplishments were also great. How is this revolutionary legacy best remembered to bring back a sense of collective commitment to a shared vision that links the past with the present as China barrels into its 21st century future? To me, this is the ideological crack at the moment. The answers to this question will help determine not just the legitimacy and staying power of the Chinese Communist Party in coming decades, but also will shape the very nature of what it means to be Chinese. All right. Thanks for bearing with me through this. Too long. All right, let me turn the lights down. All right, so any questions? Yes?
Is there any part of the National Museum, the portion of it that you talked about where they tell who the artists are, or none of them are?
No. None of those photographs have attribution. Not a single one. Some of the paintings are very well known, so people know who the artists are. Some of the paintings, actually, there was a phase in the 1950s where a lot of really important socialist realist paintings were done. And so those sometimes have attribution, but none of the photographs had any attribution whatsoever. And none of the artists who did any of the sculptures had any attribution. I know. I was flabbergasted by that. It didn't feel right to me. Not just that the artists were being overlooked, but that that's not how we do things, right? I mean, we always say who made these things, but no, it was a different. And I haven't really taken the time to think that through, why that might be. But I think it's because it's supposed to be like, this is the canon, and we're delivering it to you collectively. So it's not necessary to know who are the individuals involved. Something like that. Any other questions?
I have another question.
Yep.
The last artist that you talked about, Lu Jie,
Mm-hmm.
what was the CCP's reception of his long march?
They have never given him a minute of trouble. He's very well connected in the international art communities. He brings a lot of business into Qizhouba now. He never critiques the current leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. He just doesn't do any of that stuff. He was trained as a classical painter, and he doesn't even paint anymore himself. He just curates other people's work. So he's never had, I've asked, I said, why do you guys, how do you get away with some of the, what seems to me to be some of the outrageous things you do? And they've just said, we know how to work, basically said, we know how to work the system. That's what David said. I don't know what Li Jie, I need to talk to Li Jie sometime. And I keep saying I'm going to try to pin him down, but he's on the move. He's the guy who's on the move. A lot of these people in these high-rolling art circles are constantly on the move. Yes?
I thought it was interesting about how they're not really taking the time to recognize part of the downfalls in their modern China. I also had a professor that spoke about when she went to Beijing in 2008, how China put this big facades after having everything under construction, like we're doing better and improving, but yet behind the curtain there was like slums and people were just faking a happy place to live in.
Well, yeah, the living conditions in China vary a lot. And in 2008, that's the Olympics, right? So a lot of old Beijing that was in poor, the historic parts, but in poor condition in terms of living, were being demolished, and people were being moved aside. So of course, in those moments, there's always a lot of feelings and sentiments one way or the other about demolition. People always were given new places to live, but lots of times people just don't want to leave, right, their places. And then outside of the major urban areas, there's some very, very poor people in China still. So that's another critique that goes on that we don't hear that much about. Actually, people talk about that rather openly in China, and talk about the problems of poverty in rural areas and wanting to find ways to solve those problems. But yes, China always likes to put on a good show. So at the time of the Olympics, those things were not to be discussed. And yes, a lot of people who were poor were kind of pushed aside for the purpose of putting on a good show. Any other questions on that? Sorry, my cold is finally caught up with me.
I think it was really fascinating the government control over the artist space that used to be sort of beyond the radar of the government and now is embraced by the government.
Yes.
I thought that was a fascinating demonstration of the cultural hegemony that you're talking about.
Yeah, actually, the artists, when Huang Rui is saying, I think I'm done here, he's talking about the fact that at that point, when he's being interviewed, that process of the government becoming involved in further development of the area was already well underway. And a lot of artists have moved out. They've moved out of Beijing altogether now. And they've gone to other nearby, like an hour away drive communities, more rural communities, and set up shop elsewhere, just to get away from the push of the commercialization. Now, the people who can afford to do that are actually doing quite well for themselves. So they just don't want the government to be orchestrating, right? So they would rather, they've got the money, they can go now. They can go set up elsewhere and be away from that concern. So sometimes they're critiqued for not sticking around, right? And trying to do something to change the way the system operates. Anything else? Yes?
You briefly mentioned that there's very few comments on the setbacks, and it's like, you said like 3 or 4 pictures that were done.
Right.
Do you think even now that the government has even said that there were setbacks, that there's going to be even more comments and more clarification and critique throughout?
Well, that's a really interesting question because I thought about putting this in this talk, but there's just, I have too much stuff in this talk. But a couple of weeks ago, I read an article it was a BBC article online about a talk that one of the top party historians who always makes public proclamations on behalf of the big party. There's a party school in Beijing where Communist Party members get some education, the ones who are advancing into administrative posts. And he said he thought that there was a lot more documentation on what happened at the time of the Great Leap Forward, but he thought it would also, that some of it would probably never be revealed. And of course, governments always have stuff like that, right? Too, the United States has stuff. I mean, there's the Freedom of Information Act in the US, but there are some materials that are considered to be so sensitive in terms of national security that they'll never be revealed either. But of course, the reporters pick up on the fact that, you know, the headline was, party historian says the party will never reveal its errors. You know, so it's I don't want to whitewash, you know, what the Chinese Communist Party does in terms of these issues, because a lot of what they do, they shouldn't do. But on the other hand, most national governments do have things they don't want revealed, and they do have things that they do that they don't want other people to know that they do and they don't want publicity about. I mean, just think to the Occupy movement of 2011. There were all kinds of police out and about, you know, beating people up, and they didn't want people to, you know, nobody wanted any publicity about that stuff. So governments really tried to keep, all local governments and the national government really didn't want a lot of coverage of those events at the time. So it's sensitive business when your government is going to look bad, right? And you want to decide exactly how much of that you're going to reveal. I think that actually there will be more revelations, and I also think that, personally, I think that the one-party system in China will not always be the one-party system. But I think it will be for a while longer. Maybe in our lifetimes it won't end. But I don't think it will be that way forever. What do you think? Go on. Have you ever thought about that?
Seems pretty durable. I was going to ask him actually about that, defying the odds. The question, the big question about why now, why so much revived interest it seems in revolution. My quick answer to that, or my guess would be that the government feels sufficiently strong, secure, especially since 2008, but as the U.S. economy faltered in 07, 08, and they felt that they were very powerful. Do they feel that they're in a position where they can own the narrative enough that they can allow certain pressure valves, like these artists at Suzhou, to blow off steam and do so in a way that's not really harmful ultimately to party stability and to government stability? Do you think that's the reason we've got this revitalization, rejuvenation, revisitation of revolution here?
Maybe, but I think it's probably complicated. I mean, I think there's probably, for different people in the party hierarchy, there are different reasons. I mean, they're clear that they want to have something that's a showcase of their history. It's their history, after all. So they clearly want that, you know, so the propaganda bureau types want it for those reasons. But I think other people, like the history professors who have been advisors, probably want their, you know, to be pushing the boundaries of what can be said and done. And yes, I think that does come from a position of strength. I don't know if any of you, I don't know if you do, but my husband is Chinese. So in our house, we have a lot of Chinese. We have a Dish Network dish on our house that beams in all, like, I don't know, 25 or 30 Chinese channels. And it's an LA franchise of Dish. And so every night, until I can't stand it anymore, my husband watches these shows that are on the nightly programs in China these days about military affairs in the South China Sea and all of the battleships that are there and all the aircraft carriers that are there. So clearly there is this saber rattling and this positioning of strength going on in the country. And I I mean, these are not leaders who are talking about these things. These are regular people who want to sit around and talk about this stuff. They want to be experts on all the battleships and all this stuff, and including my husband. It's like, how can you stand to listen to this stuff? But they really think that war is coming, and they need to be strong. And who's convinced them of that? I don't know. I mean, maybe a lot of people have convinced themselves of that. And I'm sure the government doesn't do anything to discourage that kind of thinking. I don't think they're necessarily promoting it actively in this kind of television program.
You have to stay ahead of it.
Yeah, but the power of the media these days in the Chinese environment is very, very strong. And so I mean, I see this as part of that continuum, you know, that there is a positioning of strength. And I think that part of what you're saying as a rationale makes a good deal of sense. Any other questions or comments?
Maybe one more question?
Okay.
This is something I'm doing research on. In Mao's 42 speech on art and literature,
yes,
he discusses who art should be made for and who should make it,
right.
and pretty much by the people for the people.
Yep.
Do you think not putting their names down is kind of just saying this is by the people and not by a specific person?
Well, I think there is that kind of tradition, yes.
That kind of tradition.
But I really don't know. I mean, the other side, possible flip side, is that it's just laziness, right? That they really don't know who made all those photographs. So, like, if you put one name up and you don't know who made all the others, then that's kind of an embarrassment, right? So let's just not. I mean, a lot of them are journalistic photographs, right? And a lot of them probably don't have any kind. They're in files somewhere, and no, there is no attribution for them. Chinese record keeping is not the best, I have to tell you. The Chinese are not the Japanese. The Japanese are great at record keeping, but the Chinese are not so good at it, or have not been historically in that way. So I don't know. I think maybe it's also a wider, deeper cultural phenomenon. It may not just come from Mao's thoughts about this, but it may also have something to do with, you know, a lot of what's considered to be ideal knowledge in the Chinese cultural context is stuff that is simply repeated from generation to generation and memorized. So maybe it's something more like that. I mean, when I was getting advice as a PhD student from Chinese professors, I had this one professor who drove me crazy because he said, I've got a really important piece of information for you. I'd say, well, what is it? He'd say, you tell me what it is. And I'd say, what's the source? He said, I'm the source. I said, no, what's the historical source? Well, it's me. I'm telling you this. I'm going, no. Where did you find that in some kind of historical record of that time? He said, it doesn't exist there. You know, it just exists in our knowledge. You know, so it is a kind of cultural phenomenon about where knowledge resides, where it comes from, and where it resides. It resides in people's brains, as far as a lot of Chinese, you know, sort of the traditional way of Chinese education approaches it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. If anybody wants to look at books about any of this stuff, I have brought a few. I have a lot more. But help yourself to having a look. Picture books. And I'm sorry it took so long. I do, but it's not, it's not listed in the but I can send you something.